Herzlich willkommen im Haus der Kulturen der Welt. I have a task this evening which you cannot really accomplish. On the one side, I have to introduce you into the theme of rethinking race, nation, and class. Then I have to present two of the major intellectuals of our times. And to some extent, I have to relate all this to what this institution, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, is doing. The way I solve the problem is I will speak too long and too short at the same time. The Haus der Kulturen der Welt is an emancipatory project. What do racism and nationalism mean for such a project? One important insight of the book Race, Nation, Class is that these categories do not have a fixed meaning, nor do they refer to the same set of people or objects. They are rather historically as well as geographically contingent terms. That means one has to analyze how these terms operate in concrete historical contexts. Having this in mind, it is important to define from which perspective one is speaking. All that I have to say over the course of the next minutes will refer to the last 3 decades in Europe, in the West, starting with Western Europe in the 1980s, when the book of Balibar and Wallerstein was written. With reference to the incredible, valuable research and reflections of Etienne Baliba and Immanuel Wallerstein, and with reference to our work here at the HKW during the last years, I would like to elaborate on the historical shift which took place during the last 3 decades and how that has triggered new dynamics between these terms. The objective of Balibar and Wallerstein in Race, Nation, Class is, as I understand it, to analyze these concepts from an emancipatory perspective. It is this perspective which I share. At the same time, I will show what challenges this perspective encounters today, over 30 years after the publication of the book. Let us first understand how these categories are function. What do people aim at when they refer to the nation or to race, or as Balibar and Wallerstein would add today, religion? Wallerstein's answer is that these terms are employed by those who want to root their opinions, arguments, with reference to a group in the past, be it cultural, be it biological, as opposed to a rational, universalistic discourse in the present, which seems to be manipulated. What does that mean for an emancipatory project? An emancipatory project, from my perspective, is a project which provides space and opportunities to develop subjectivities. This is not a neoliberal project. With subjectivity, I do not refer to an atomistic entity, but rather understand it as an interracial concept. The subjectivity of an individual unfolds in interactions with others. But there are limits to this process. It is not possible to interact with all the living people in the world. This is a spatial limitation. But it is also not possible to be in a conversation with all ancestors. This is a historical limitation. There are 2 ways to compensate these anthropological limitations. The one is by constructing a past based on culture, religion, or race. It is a freezing of a realm of interactions which cannot be executed. In the discourse, they are taken for granted. The other one is a reference to the future. It is a claim of a universalistic position which is only potentially actualized in the present moment. Besides the anthropological restrictions on unfolding subjectivity, There are political ones based on the asymmetry of power. And here culture, religion, and race play an ambivalent role. On the one side, they can be used to legitimize the people in power. Those in power claim to have the superior culture, the one and only religion, or are legitimized by nature. That means race. For the emancipatory project, this means that these people claim to have the right to put constraints on the subjective unfoldings of others. But the very same categories can also be mobilized by the suppressed as a temporal project and are thereby legitimate from my perspective. For example, fighting colonial powers with nationalism based on cultural arguments or a construction of a common political origin. In this case, the individual actively involved in this struggle accepts constraints to his, her subjectivity in the name of the common struggle against the suppressor, with the hope that when the struggle succeeds, there is also a wider space for him or her. That means the individual delegates part of his, her subjectivity to the group. The problem of this process is the question of representation, which is often delegated to leaders. In traditional communities, there are usually institutionalized or ritualized processes with which to define leaders. In the modern battles, however, this happens in less formalized and sometimes unwitting ways, which produce its own repercussions. The alternative strategy to deal with power asymmetries is the creation of institutions. Institutions mediate between individual subjects and larger wholes, be they companies, be they states. They do that by establishing procedures which translate subjective views into larger contexts. This is only possible by partly abstracting from the subjective perspective and objectifying it. This is not an invention of modernity, yet modern institutions claim to have a universal, rational foundation for such entities and are not grounded in specific traditions. Thus, modern institutions draw their legitimacy from the fact that individual subjects partly accept to become objectified in order to gain more freedom and possibility in other realms. An example, you become a member of a union and accepts its rules. That means you give up part of your freedom because the union guarantees you more labor security and income. The problem modern institutions are facing is that they are no longer able to deal with the actual challenges of our time and therefore lose their legitimacy. These challenges are grounded in the fast, interruptive, transformational processes driven by capitalism, knowledge production, and technology. National states, such as Greece, lose their national sovereignty and as a result can no longer guarantee the welfare of their citizens. Labor unions lose their power because capital globalizes more and more. Even in academia, classical disciplines are no longer able to provide an adequate knowledge in a world where knowledge is directly transformed into commodities and technologies, increasingly creating faster new realities. At the same time, modern institutions are replaced by the institutions of the digital world. They seem to compensate the weaknesses of the modern institutions. They transcend local, regional, and national borders. Facebook connects individuals globally. Google's research engine provides knowledge from all the times. But a closer look shows that we have to pay a high price for these advantages because these technologies do not provide the means to develop subjectivities. Instead, they turn people into atomized individuals. Individuals who press the like button do not engage in a real interaction with other people. Instead of exchanging views in a real dialogue, pushing the button seems like a natural event. Therefore, one has to read the biological terminology of going viral literally. The strategy of data mining develops this even further. Subjective expressions are turned into data in order to sell them in the market. In the frame of the new knowledge economies, people are reduced to producers and consumers, two roles which are mediated by data, which belong to the big tech companies. On the basis of this analysis, I would argue that the real challenge for an emancipatory project today are these new forms of technologically driven capitalism, which literally abstract the relatedness of social interactions out of the social world and turn subjects into atomized individuals. The failure in social development during the last decades was that we were not able to establish the right form of institutions to translate the capital techno-development into a social-political project. We created the instruments to act globally, but not to live a human life on a global scale. Instead of accepting the challenge of developing new institutions, the new nationalisms, religious movements, and racisms pursue the socio-political project by looking backwards to the so-called common roots in the past. I'm very grateful to our guest of honor tonight, Etienne Baliba, that he opened our eyes to the historical embeddedness of race, class, and nation already 30 years ago, and I hope I could show how one can use this methodological insight to understand our situation today. But there is a second lesson to learn from Etienne Balibar's thinking, which is crucial for our work here at the HKW, namely that theory has to be connected to practice. Therefore, we develop new practices of engagement which serve as experimental models to explore new forms of interactions between humans and humans, as well as humans and technology. These models are spaces of imagination, which we, as a public finance institution, do not have to sell. Instead of commodifying them in a business model, we offer them for a public discourse. We owe the next 2 days of programming to the two visionary people who, as I hope to show, provided us with conceptual means to understand our world today: Etienne Baliba and Immanuel Wallerstein. It is a great pleasure, as well as an honor, to welcome one of the two here tonight, Etienne Baliba. Please take a seat. Feel free. Yes, no problem. But I would like also to pay tribute to the person who cannot be here with us tonight, Immanuel Wallerstein, and introduce him to you before I introduce Etienne Baliba. I mean, I introduced the both already quite a lot, but there's more to say. Immanuel Wallerstein's wide-ranging and seminal work are widely known to the general public. 50 years after the global shockwave of 1968, it seems fitting to begin by highlighting his role in supporting the student protests at Columbia University as a young professor. As far as his political engagement is concerned, it is important to mention his close association with the World Social Forum in successive locations. and that he has been a regular visitor and interlocutor at the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico. In 1976, he was granted the opportunity to found the Fanon-Brodel Center for the Study of Economics, Historical Systems, and Civilizations at the Binghamton University in New York, and became the founding editor of its in-house journal, Review. During his distinguished academic career, he has served as a visiting scholar in many renowned institutions across the world and has been a senior research scholar at Yale University since 2000. He is also known for his close collaboration with Asian scholars, not only in China, but in India and other parts. The paradigm for which he is best known today is world system analysis, which can be understood as a collective work together with other prominent scholars and theoreticians. Wallerstein, one could say, is not only the senior and most distinguished figure in contemporary post-Marxist thought, but quite simply one of the greatest of social sciences in the recent decades. His yearly visit to the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme brought him into constant dialogue with Fanon-Brodel. For this reason, it is widely assumed that Wallerstein is a disciple of Brodel's, who more or less combined the Marxism and the Brodelian legacies. Yet we can also clearly see that Brodel's debt to Wallerstein is considerable in his own work. And in fact, it is fair to say that the two scholars had a reciprocal influence on each other. But now let me turn to Etienne Baliba, who we have the pleasure to have amongst us tonight. He is a philosopher and professor emeritus of moral and political philosophy at the University Paris-Nanterre. He also holds the anniversary chair in modern European philosophy at Kingston University, London, and teaches at Columbia University in New York. He is a leading Marxist intellectual and has lectured and published widely in the areas of epistemology, Marxist philosophy, and moral and political philosophy in general by investigating the question of critique with special reference to religion and political economy, racism, and nationalism. Balibar works for a renewal of Marxist theory and practice, taking into account the challenges put to critical theory and practice by racism and nationalism. He was expelled from the French Communist Party in 1981 after critiquing the party's policy on immigration and its inherent racism. Balibar studied with Althusser at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris and co-authored, alongside others, this seminal volume, Reading Capital, in 1965, as well as writing further fundamental works on Marxist theory and philosophy. In the last 2 decades or so, he was engaged with the destiny of the European project and its shortcomings and potentials. And so his writings and many lectures and talks that he has given recently demonstrate an even bigger urgency to renew this project. Many of the concepts, studies, and methodologies used in his work were developed from race, nation, class into questions of transnational citizenship, the constitution of the nation-state and its violence, as well as a seminal interrogation into the study of anthropological difference in his most recent book, Citizen Subject: Foundations for Philosophical Anthropology. Please welcome with me again, Etienne Baliba.